phones shouldn't ring in a place that's been dead for 30 years. Welcome to another night with Infernal Radio, where the stories we tell aren't just fiction, they're warnings whispered from the spaces between worlds. In tonight's tale, we'll challenge everything you believe about parallel realities and the voices that call to us from the other side. Picture yourself alone in the decrepit halls of Millbrook State Hospital at 11 p.m., where the air tastes of rust and forgotten screams, where every shadow seems to breathe with the weight of countless tortured souls who never found their way out. You might think you're prepared for what lurks in abandoned places, but this story will show you that some buildings don't just house ghosts, they house entire universes of terror. If you're brave enough to face what lies beyond the veil of our reality, subscribe now and join our community of those who dare to listen when the darkness speaks. But tell me this, when you hear your own voice warning you of death, do you trust it or do you run? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from Mitha Storyteller. Tonight is a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. Let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and what city you're listening from. I'm curious to know how many of you are experiencing this nightmare across different time zones. Different realities, perhaps. Some doors should never be opened, but tonight, we're walking through them anyway. Marcus Chen had taken the job because desperation makes you stupid. Stupid people end up in places like Millbrook State Hospital at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with nothing but a flashlight and the kind of minimum wage security position that nobody else wanted. The hospital had been abandoned since 1994, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings. It's connected by underground tunnels that the state couldn't afford to demolish and couldn't figure out how to sell. So it sat like a tumor on the edge of Grayfield, slowly rotting from the inside out while lawyers argued over liability and environmental cleanup costs that would never materialize. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts, which made him perfect for the job according to his supervisor, a tired man named Kellerman, who handed over the keys with the kind of relief that suggested he'd been waiting years for someone dumb enough to take the night shift. The pay was decent for doing nothing more than walking predetermined routes through empty hallways and checking that vandals hadn't broken into spray paint gang tags on walls that had already seen enough human misery. But as Marcus pushed through the main entrance doors that groaned like dying animals, he began to understand why the position had such high turnover. The building felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural nonsense and everything to do with the weight of institutional horror. The kind of place where electroshock therapy had been administered like aspirin and lobotomies had been considered cutting-edge treatment for everything from depression to homosexuality. His footsteps echoed through corridors lined with peeling paint and broken windows that let in just enough moonlight to create shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And Marcus found himself checking his phone every few minutes. Not because he expected calls, but because the silence was so complete, it felt predatory, like something huge and patient was holding its breath just beyond his perception. The security office was located in the basement of the administration building, a cramped room filled with monitors that displayed static from cameras that had been disconnected years ago. And it was here that Marcus first noticed the telephone system, an ancient collection of black rotary phones connected to a switchboard that looked like it belonged in a museum, complete with tangled wires and operator headsets that hung from hooks, like the preserved remains of some extinct communication species. According to his orientation materials, the phone system had been shut down when the hospital closed, the lines disconnected, and the numbers reassigned to other state facilities. But as Marcus settled into his chair and began reviewing the patrol schedule, he couldn't shake the feeling that the phones were watching him with their dark receivers and numbered dials that seemed to gleam. Despite the decades of dust that coated everything else in the room, the first call came at 12:47 a.m., shrill ring. That cut through the basement silence like a scream, and Marcus stared at the rotary phone in the center of the switchboard as it continued its impossible summons, the sound echoing off concrete walls that hadn't heard human voices in decades. He knew the phones were dead, had been told repeatedly during his brief training that the entire telecommunications infrastructure had been severed when the state pulled funding. Yet the black bakelite receiver trembled with each ring as if something on the other end was growing increasingly desperate for acknowledgement. Marcus reached for the phone with the kind of morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at car accidents. Lifting the heavy receiver to his ear and hearing nothing but static at first, then a voice that made his blood turn to ice water because it was his own voice. Exactly his own voice. Speaking with the same slight lisp he'd had since childhood, and the same nervous habit of clearing his throat before important statements. "Marcus," the voice said, and the familiarity of it made him want to hang up immediately. "You need to listen to me very carefully, because I don't have much time and neither do you. And I know this is going to sound insane, but I'm calling. From another version of this night, another version of this place, and in exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes, you're going to die unless you do exactly what I tell you." The rational part of Marcus's mind immediately began cataloging explanations elaborate prank. Hidden cameras, some kind of voice modulation technology, but the voice continued with details that no prankster could have known, describing the scar on his left knee from a childhood bike accident that he'd never told anyone about, mentioning his mother's maiden name and the recurring nightmare he'd been having since he was 8 years old about drowning in a bathtub filled with black water. "This is real," the voice said, anticipating his skepticism. "And I know you're thinking about your scar and wondering how I know about the dream with the bathtub. But that's because I am you, Marcus. I'm the version of you who didn't listen to this warning, who thought it was impossible, who died at 3:17 a.m. when the thing that lives in room 237 finally found what it was looking for." Marcus felt his grip tighten on the receiver as the voice described the hospital's layout with perfect accuracy, mentioning the broken window on the second floor that let in cold air, the water stain on the ceiling of the east corridor that looked like a map of some unknown continent. Details that could only be known by someone who was actually here, actually walking these same hallways. "You're going to want to investigate," the voice continued. "You're going to think you can handle whatever is happening here. But Marcus, listen to me. The phone system isn't just connected to other phones. It's connected to other realities, other versions of this night where different choices were made, and the thing that killed me is hunting all of us. Every version of us that took this job, every Marcus Chen who was desperate enough to work nights in an abandoned mental hospital." The line crackled with interference that sounded almost like screaming, and for a moment Marcus could hear other voices in the background, dozens of them all speaking with his voice, all trying to talk at once in a cacophony of warning and panic that made his head throb with sympathetic pain. "We tried everything," the original voice said, cutting through the chaos. "We tried running. We tried calling for help. We tried destroying the phones, but it always finds us at 3:17. It's always in room 237. And the only reason I can call you now is because I'm already dead, Marcus. I'm calling from the moment after. From the space between heartbeats where all the versions of us who failed are trapped, watching the ones who haven't died yet, and hoping that maybe this time will be different." Marcus hung up the phone with shaking hands, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the impossible conversation. And he found himself staring at the switchboard, as if it might ring again, at any moment, with more warnings from alternate versions of himself. The logical thing to do was leave, walk out the front door, and never come back. Forfeit the job and the money, and chalk the whole experience up to stress-induced hallucination. But desperation had brought him here, and desperation kept him rooted to his chair as he tried to process what he'd heard. Instead of fleeing, Marcus did what any rational person would do when confronted with the impossible. He began looking for evidence. Starting with the hospital records that were stored in filing cabinets throughout the basement, yellowed folders containing decades of patient files, staff schedules, and incident reports that painted a picture of Millbrook State Hospital that was far darker than the sanitized version he'd been told during orientation. The files revealed a pattern of experimental treatments that went far beyond standard psychiatric care, documenting research projects funded by government agencies with names that were mostly redacted, studies involving sensory deprivation, electromagnetic therapy, and something called Project Mirror, that seemed to involve attempts at what the heavily censored documents described as consciousness transfer experiments. Marcus found references to room 237 scattered throughout the files, always in connection with patients who had experienced what the staff euphemistically called communication episodes. Instances where individuals claim to be receiving messages from alternate versions of themselves, hearing voices that knew intimate details about their lives but warned of terrible futures that hadn't yet come to pass. Dr. Elizabeth Krensky's research notes, dated from 1987 to 1993, described room 237 as the focal point of the hospital's interdimensional research, a place where the barriers between parallel realities had been deliberately weakened through the use of electromagnetic fields and psychoactive drugs administered to unwilling patients who served as unwitting test subjects in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The room had been equipped with a sophisticated telephone system that Dr. Krensky believed could facilitate communication across dimensional boundaries, allowing contact with alternate versions of reality where different choices had been made, different outcomes achieved, and according to her increasingly frantic notes, the experiments had been successful beyond their wildest expectations. Patients in room 237 began reporting contact with versions of themselves from other dimensions, receiving warnings about future events, advice about decisions they hadn't yet made, detailed descriptions of lives they might have lived under. Different circumstances, but the communications came with a terrible cost that Dr. Krensky documented with clinical detachment that barely concealed her growing horror. The alternate selves that made contact were invariably from realities where the patients had died. Versions that existed in some liminal space between life and death, trapped in the moment of their demise and desperately trying to warn their living counterparts about the dangers they faced. But each communication seemed to weaken the barriers further, allowing something else to slip through, something that Dr. Krensky referred to only as the convergence entity, a predatory consciousness that fed on the energy released when dimensional boundaries collapsed. The final entry in Dr. Krensky's notes was dated 3 days before the hospital's sudden closure, describing how the entity had learned to mimic the voices of the dead, using their warnings as bait to lure more victims into room 237, where it could harvest their life force at the moment of maximum terror and despair. Marcus read these files with growing dread. Understanding now that his phone call hadn't been from another version of himself at all, but from something much worse. Something that had been feeding on the fear and confusion of night security guards for over 30 years, perfecting its mimicry and learning exactly what to say to keep its victims from fleeing until it was too late to escape. The phone rang again at 1:23 a.m. And this time, Marcus was ready for it, his hand hovering over the receiver as he mentally prepared himself to confront whatever entity was using his voice to manipulate him into staying in this place of accumulated horror. But when he lifted the phone, the voice that greeted him was different somehow. Still his voice, but with subtle variations in tone and inflection that suggested this was indeed a different version of himself. One that spoke with the weary authority of someone who had survived experiences that his current self couldn't imagine. "Marcus," the voice said, "I know what you're thinking. You think the first call was from some kind of predatory entity trying to lure you to your death. And you're partially right, but you're also wrong in ways that could get you killed if you don't listen. This is the real me calling, the version of you who survived the night but paid a price that I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I need you to understand that the convergence entity Dr. Krensky wrote about is real, but it's not the only thing using the phone system to reach across dimensional boundaries. The entity feeds on terror and confusion, yes. But there are also genuine warnings coming through, calls from versions of us who died learning truths that could save your life. If you're smart enough to tell the difference between authentic communication and predatory mimicry," the voice described details from Dr. Krensky's files that Marcus had just read, confirming that this caller had access to the same information. But then it began sharing insights that weren't in any of the documents, explaining how the electromagnetic experiments had created what amounted to a dimensional weak point that allowed consciousness to leak between parallel realities under specific conditions. Every version of you that takes this job experiences variations of the same night, the voice continued, but the outcomes change based on the choices you make, the information you accept or reject, and most importantly, whether you can distinguish between the voices of the dead Marcus Chens, who want to help you, And the entity that wears our voice like a mask while it hunts you through the corridors of every reality where Millbrook State Hospital exists. The real Marcus's voices always give you specific, actionable information, the caller explained. While the entity relies on vague warnings and emotional manipulation designed to keep you paralyzed by fear until 3:17 a.m., when the dimensional barriers are at their weakest, and it can physically manifest in room 237 to claim another victim. "I'm going to tell you something that will prove I'm real," the voice said. And Marcus felt his skepticism wavering as the caller described the exact contents of his wallet, including a $20 bill with a corner torn off that he'd been meaning to exchange but kept forgetting about, details that no entity could have gleaned from other dimensions because they were too mundane, too specific to his individual experience. "In the reality I came from," the voice continued, "I made the mistake of going to room 237 at exactly 3:17 a.m. because I believed the entity's warning that staying away would somehow make things worse. But what I discovered there changed everything. I thought I knew about the nature of consciousness and the price of survival. The room isn't just a focal point for interdimensional communication. Marcus, it's a trap designed to harvest the moment of death from as many versions of ourselves as possible. And the entity doesn't just feed on our terror, it feeds on the quantum energy released when multiple versions of the same consciousness are terminated simultaneously across different realities. But here's what Dr. Krensky never understood," the voice said. And Marcus found himself leaning closer to the phone despite every instinct telling him to hang up. The entity isn't invincible, and it isn't the only intelligence that learned to use the dimensional weak points to its advantage. Some of us, the ones who survived, we learned to fight back. And we've been trying to save every subsequent version of ourselves who walks into this trap, one phone call at a time. Marcus knew he should stay in the security office, should barricade himself behind the desk and wait for dawn. But the voice's mention of room 237 had planted a seed of curiosity that grew more insistent with each passing minute until he found himself climbing the basement stairs toward the main hospital corridors. The building felt different now that he understood its history. The shadows deeper and more purposeful, the silence pregnant with the weight of consciousness, experiments that had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself, and every creaking floorboard seemed to announce his presence to things that had been waiting decades for another night security guard to stumble into their web. Room 237 was located on the second floor of the East Wing, according to the hospital schematics he'd memorized during training. But as Marcus navigated the maze of corridors with his flashlight cutting weak paths through the darkness, he began to notice inconsistencies that suggested the building's layout wasn't as stable as he'd assumed. Hallways seemed longer than they should be. Doors appeared where his memory insisted there had been blank walls. And more than once he found himself in sections of the hospital that didn't match any of the blueprints he'd studied, as if the building was subtly rearranging itself to guide him toward some predetermined destination. When he finally found room 237, the door was standing open, despite the fact that all patient rooms should have been secured. And inside, Marcus could see a space that defied the hospital's standard architectural layout, a circular chamber dominated by an elaborate telephone switchboard that looked like the bastard offspring of early telecommunications. Technology and some kind of arcane ritual apparatus. The room was larger than it should have been given the building's structure, its curved walls lined with dozens of rotary phones of different vintages. Some black bakelite models from the 1940s. Others the colorful plastic designs from the 1970s. All connected by a web of wires that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly and suggested geometries that existed in more than 3 dimensions. In the center of the room stood a chair that looked like a cross between an electric chair and an operator's workstation, equipped with restraints that had been worn smooth by decades of use and a headset that connected to the main switchboard. Through cables thick as anacondas, Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that this was where Dr. Krensky's patients had been strapped down and forced to serve as unwilling conduits for interdimensional communication. The phones were all ringing now, cacophony of different tones and pitches that created an almost musical pattern. And as Marcus stepped closer to the switchboard, he could hear fragments of conversation bleeding through the receivers, dozens Voices that all sounded like variations of his own voice, some pleading for help, others screaming warnings. A few laughing with the kind of hysteria that comes from witnessing truths too terrible for human comprehension. He picked up one of the phones at random and heard a version of himself describing a reality where he had never taken the job at Millbrook, where he had chosen to work at a mall security position instead. But even in that alternate timeline, something had found him. It's a manifestation of the same entity that had learned to hunt Marcus Chen across every possible version of his life. Another phone connected him to a reality, where he had arrived at the hospital during the day shift and discovered that the building was still operational, still conducting experiments on patients who begged him to help them escape from procedures. That were turning their minds into broadcast stations for otherworldly intelligences that spoke in voices stolen from the dead. The third phone he tried was silent for a long moment before a voice that wasn't quite his own began speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Syllables that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and inscribe themselves directly onto his consciousness, filling his head with images of vast spaces between dimensions where predatory entities waited like spiders in webs, made of collapsed timelines and harvested screams. Marcus dropped the phone and staggered backward from the switchboard. But the alien voice continued speaking inside his head, its incomprehensible words creating visual hallucinations of realities where the Millbrook experiments had succeeded beyond Dr. Krensky's wildest nightmares. Dimensions where the hospital had become a nexus point for entities that fed on human consciousness and grew stronger with each mind they consumed. The images came in rapid succession. Operating theaters where surgeons with too many arms performed procedures on patients whose screams harmonized with otherworldly frequencies. Corridors filled with shambling figures that had once been hospital staff but now served as hosts for parasitic intelligences from spaces between dimensions, always in every vision. The same circular room with its web of ringing telephones and the central chair where unwilling subjects were transformed into biological telecommunication devices. As the hallucinations faded, Marcus found himself back in the regular hospital corridor, standing outside what appeared to be an ordinary patient room with a simple wooden door marked 237 in faded paint. And for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined the entire experience, if the stress and isolation had finally pushed him over the edge into full psychotic breakdown. But then he noticed his reflection in the darkened window at the end of the hallway. What he saw there made him understand that his brief contact with the alien intelligence had left marks that went deeper than hallucination, because his reflection was moving independently of his body, mouthing words that he couldn't hear but somehow understood, were warnings about what would happen if he didn't leave the building immediately. The reflection pointed frantically toward the exit, its face twisted with an expression of terror that Marcus had never worn in life. And as he watched, other reflections began appearing in windows throughout the corridor. Dozens of versions of himself from realities where he had made different choices, all gesturing desperately for him to run while behind them. Barely visible in the reflected depths, something vast and hungry pressed itself against the dimensional barriers that separated the realities. Marcus turned away from the windows and ran toward the stairwell, his footsteps echoing through corridors that seemed to stretch and contract around him like the breathing passages of some enormous organism. And as he descended toward the basement, he could hear the phones ringing throughout the building. It's not just in room 237, but in every room, every office, every abandoned space where communication devices had once connected the hospital to the outside world. The sound followed him down the stairs and through the basement corridors, growing louder rather than fainter as he put distance between himself and the source, as if the entire building had become a single massive receiver tuned to frequencies that existed between dimensions, picking up signals from realities where the Millbrook experiments had transformed the hospital into something that was no longer entirely anchored in any single universe. When he reached the security office, Marcus found that the switchboard was fully lit, every indicator bulb glowing with soft red light, every phone receiver vibrating against its cradle with incoming calls from versions of reality where he had already died, already been consumed, already been transformed into another voice in the entity's collection of stolen identities. He grabbed his jacket and car keys, determined to leave before 3:17 a.m., arrived with whatever terrible revelation awaited him in that circular room that might or might not exist, depending on which version of reality was currently in control of the building's architecture. But as he reached for the door handle, the phone on his desk rang with a tone he hadn't heard before, deeper and more resonant than the others. And despite every rational thought screaming at him to ignore it, Marcus found himself reaching for the receiver because the sound carried with it a quality of desperate urgency that suggested this call might be different from all the others. The voice that answered was his own, but older somehow, weathered by experiences that his current self couldn't comprehend, speaking with the authority of someone who had survived multiple encounters with the hospital's dimensional anomalies and learned secrets that came at a terrible cost. "Marcus," the voice said, "I know you're about to run. And in most timelines, that's exactly what you should do. But in this specific reality, at this exact moment, running will guarantee your death because the entity has learned to hunt across dimensional boundaries. And there are versions of you in parallel realities who tried to escape and were picked off one by one, in parking lots, in cars, and hotels miles away from Millbrook. Consumed by something that can travel between worlds faster than you can drive between cities. This is Marcus Prime calling," the voice continued, using a designation that sounded both absurd and terrifyingly official. "And I'm the version of you who figured out how to survive not just one night at the hospital, but multiple encounters with the entity across 17 different dimensional iterations. And what I've learned is that the thing hunting us isn't just one creature. It's a collective consciousness made up of every version of every security guard who was ever consumed by the original entity, including dozens of Marcus Chens who thought they were clever enough to outsmart something that exists outside the normal parameters of space and time. The calls you've been receiving aren't from parallel versions of yourself," Marcus Prime explained. "They're from fragments of consciousness that the entity absorbed and repurposed as psychological weapons. Using your own voice and memories to create the illusion of helpful alternate selves, while actually manipulating you into making the exact choices that will lead to your consumption at 3:17 a.m. in room 237. But here's what the entity doesn't know," the voice continued. And Marcus found himself listening despite every instinct telling him this was just another manipulation. "There really are parallel versions of you calling across dimensional boundaries, survivors like me who learn to distinguish between authentic interdimensional communication and the entity's psychological warfare, and we've been working together across multiple realities to develop a strategy that might actually break the cycle of consumption that has been repeating for over 30 years. The key is understanding that the entity feeds on terror and confusion, but it's also vulnerable to coordinated resistance from multiple dimensional versions of the same target. Because when several iterations of Marcus Chen work together instead of being picked off individually, we can create what amounts to a quantum feedback loop that disrupts the creature's ability to maintain coherent form across multiple realities simultaneously." Marcus's Prime's voice became more urgent as he explained that at this very moment, versions of Marcus Chen in at least 12 parallel dimensions were executing coordinated actions designed to overload the entity's sensory capabilities, breeding windows of vulnerability that could be exploited if the Marcus in this reality was willing to trust information that sounded insane but had been tested and refined through dozens of failed attempts in other timelines. "You need to go back to room 237, the voice said. Marcus felt his blood freeze, because this was exactly what he'd expected the entity to eventually demand. But not at 3:17 a.m., not when it's strongest, but right now at 2:31 a.m., when the other versions of us are creating maximum dimensional interference, and instead of sitting in the chair like a victim, you need to use the switchboard to coordinate with your parallel selves and turn the hospital's own interdimensional communication system against the thing that's been using it to hunt us. The phones in that room aren't just receivers," Marcus Prime explained. "They're transmitters capable of broadcasting across dimensional boundaries. And if you can synchronize your actions with the other surviving versions of yourself, you can create a resonance cascade that will either destroy the entity or at minimum trap it in a dimensional loop where it can't reach any more victims." "I know this sounds like exactly the kind of trap the entity would set," the voice admitted. "But Marcus, look at your watch. Look at the time and ask yourself this. if I were the entity trying to lure you to your death, why would I be calling you 36 minutes before the killing hour instead of using those 36 minutes to build your terror to maximum intensity, the way it always does with its victims? Marcus looked at his watch and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature, because the voice was right. Every previous call had come at seemingly random times designed to build psychological pressure. But this call had come at exactly to 31 a.m., a time that felt calculated and purposeful in a way that suggested genuine coordination rather than predatory manipulation. Against every survival instinct he possessed, Marcus found himself climbing the stairs toward the second floor again. But this time his journey through the hospital corridors felt different, as if the building's reality was stabilizing around him rather than shifting and changing to confuse his navigation. Room 237's door was closed when he reached it. A simple wooden barrier that looked perfectly normal until he touched the handle and felt the electric tingle of dimensional energy flowing through the metal. It's a sensation that made his teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges, as if he were looking through water that was moving in directions that didn't exist in normal space. When he opened the door, the circular chamber was exactly as he had seen it before. But now the web of telephones was silent except for one black rotary phone in the center of the switchboard that was ringing with a slow, deliberate rhythm that somehow conveyed urgency without panic. Marcus approached the central chair with extreme reluctance, understanding that sitting in it would make him vulnerable to whatever forces had been unleashed in this room over the decades. But as he lifted the ringing phone, he could hear multiple versions of his own voice speaking in careful coordination, counting down from 10 in perfect synchronization across what sounded like dozens of parallel realities. "On my mark," said a voice that might have been Marcus's prime, "we initiate the resonance cascade, and remember, no matter what you see or hear during the process, do not let go of that phone, because breaking the connection will leave you isolated and vulnerable to direct attack by the entity's focused attention." The countdown reached 0, and Marcus found himself speaking in unison with his parallel selves.
Ow.
Reciting words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Syllables that seemed to vibrate through the hospital's structure and create standing waves in the dimensional fabric that surrounded the building like a cocoon of warped space-time. The other phones in the room began ringing in sequence, creating a complex pattern of sound that hurt his ears, but seemed to be having an effect on something vast and invisible that pressed against the room's boundaries with increasing desperation. Through the receivers, he could hear the entity's voice. It's no longer disguised as helpful alternate versions of himself, but revealed in its true form as something composed of screaming fragments of every consciousness it had ever consumed, a collective nightmare that spoke in the voices of decades of victims, all crying out in unison for release from whatever hell existed in the spaces between dimensions. The resonance cascade was working, Marcus realized, as cracks of light began appearing in the air around him. Fissures in reality that revealed glimpses of other versions of the room where different iterations of himself were performing identical rituals. Their combined effort creating a quantum interference pattern that was disrupting the entity's ability to maintain coherent existence across multiple realities. But as the entity's howls of rage and pain grew louder, Marcus began to understand that Marcus Prime hadn't told him everything about the cost of this coordination, because he could feel pieces of his consciousness being drawn through the dimensional cracks toward his parallel selves, and he began to suspect that surviving this encounter might require a kind of sacrifice that would leave him fundamentally changed. No longer entirely the same Marcus Chen who had walked into Millbrook State Hospital at the beginning of his shift, but something new and strange that existed partially in multiple realities simultaneously. The dimensional cracks widened as the resonance cascade intensified, and through the tears in reality, Marcus could see not just alternate versions of himself performing the same ritual, but glimpses of what lay beyond the hospital in those other dimensions, realities where the Millbrook experiments had succeeded in creating permanent gateways between worlds, transforming the abandoned building into a nexus point where beings from impossible geometries gathered to feed on the terror and confusion of human consciousness. In one reality, he glimpsed a version of the hospital that was still operational but staffed by creatures that had once been human doctors and nurses. their bodies elongated and twisted by exposure to interdimensional energies, performing surgeries on patients whose screams harmonized with frequencies that opened portals to spaces where physics operated according to alien mathematics. Another crack revealed a dimension where the hospital had become a massive organic structure, its walls pulsing with veins that carried not blood, but liquid consciousness harvested from victims across multiple realities, feeding a central intelligence that grew larger and more complex with each mind it absorbed into its collective nightmare. The entity that had been hunting Marcus across dimensional boundaries was writhing in the center of the room now, its form becoming visible as the cascade disrupted its ability to remain hidden between realities, and what he saw defied every assumption he'd made about the nature of his tormentor. The creature wasn't a single predatory intelligence, but a writhing mass of human faces. Dozens of security guards who had been consumed over the decades, their features twisted with eternal agony as they were forced to serve as components in a larger organism that used their memories and personalities as weapons against future victims. Marcus could see his own face among the trapped souls, versions of himself from realities where the resonance cascade had failed, where he had been absorbed into the entity's collective consciousness and transformed into just another voice calling through the dimensional telephone network to lure new victims to their doom. But the cascade was working, he realized, as the entity's form began to destabilize and fragment, pieces of absorbed consciousness breaking away from the central mass. As the quantum interference pattern disrupted the bonds that held the collective together, the faces of long-dead security guards were screaming not with pain but with relief as they were finally released from decades of imprisonment within the entity's psychic structure. Their individual consciousnesses dissolving into whatever afterlife awaited beings who had been trapped between dimensions for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to exist as separate entities. Marcus could feel the pull of that dissolution himself, the tempting prospect of simply letting go and allowing his consciousness to disperse into the quantum foam that existed between realities. But Marcus Prime's voice was still speaking through the phone, urging him to maintain focus and complete the ritual that would trap the entity's core intelligence in a dimensional loop where it could no longer reach across realities to claim new victims. The cost of this victory was becoming clear now, as Marcus felt pieces of his memory and personality being drawn into the parallel versions of himself, his individual identity beginning to blur and merge with the Marcus Chens from other dimensions, until he could no longer tell which thoughts and experiences belonged to his original self and which had been borrowed from alternate realities where he had made different choices, lived different lives, died different deaths. But even as his sense of individual identity dissolved, Marcus understood that this merger was not destruction, but transformation. The birth of something new that existed simultaneously across multiple realities, a version of himself that could navigate the dimensional networks that connected the hospital to other points in space and time, ensuring that no future victim would face the entity's predations alone. As the resonance cascade reached its peak intensity, Marcus felt his consciousness expanding across dimensional boundaries, his awareness suddenly encompassing not just his own reality but dozens of parallel versions, where different iterations of the Millbrook experiments had produced varying degrees of horror and revelation. In one dimension, he experienced the memories of a Marcus Chen who had arrived at the hospital to find Dr. Krensky still alive, still conducting experiments on patients who begged for death, but were kept conscious and aware as their minds were slowly dissolved into component frequencies that could be broadcast across interdimensional networks. In another reality, he lived through the experiences of a security guard who had discovered that the entity wasn't malevolent at all, but a desperate collective of consciousnesses trying to escape from a reality where humanity had been completely consumed by something even worse, their attempts to warn other versions of themselves misinterpreted as predatory behavior. The most disturbing revelation came from a dimension where the Marcus Chen who had taken the night shift at Millbrook had discovered that he wasn't human at all, but an artificial construct created by the entity to serve as bait for the real Marcus Chen from the primary reality. A decoy designed to lure the authentic version into a dimensional trap where his genuine human consciousness could be harvested and used to power even more sophisticated interdimensional communication systems. But as these alternate memories flooded through his expanding awareness, Marcus began to understand that the nature of identity itself was far more fluid than he had ever imagined. That consciousness was not a fixed property belonging to individual entities, but rather a kind of quantum field that could be shaped and reshaped by exposure to dimensional energies. And the version of himself that was emerging from this merger was something entirely new. Neither fully human nor entirely other, but a hybrid intelligence capable of existing simultaneously across multiple realities. The entity's death throes were shaking the hospital's foundations, causing dimensional ripples that propagated outward from room 237, like waves in a pond. And through his enhanced perception, Marcus could see how these disturbances were affecting other locations where similar experiments had been conducted, a network of abandoned hospitals and research facilities scattered across the globe, each one a potential nexus point where the barriers between realities had been deliberately weakened by researchers who had no comprehension of the forces they were unleashing. In some of these facilities, similar entities had already established themselves, feeding on the fear and confusion of night security guards, maintenance workers, and urban explorers who stumbled into dimensional weak points and found themselves facing predators that hunted across parallel realities. But now, with the Millbrook entity destroyed and its collective consciousness dispersed, these other creatures would be vulnerable to similar resonance cascades. Coordinated attacks launched simultaneously across multiple dimensions by versions of their victims who had learned to work together instead of being picked off individually. Marcus Prime's voice was fading now as the phone system that had enabled their coordination began to shut down.
Now the dimensional weak point that had made interdimensional communication possible,
Finally collapsing as the entity's death eliminated the psychic energy that had kept the portal stable. But before the connection was severed completely, Marcus heard his parallel self deliver one final piece of information that changed everything he thought. He understood about his situation and his role in the larger pattern of events that had been unfolding not just at Millbrook, but at similar facilities around the world. "You were never random," Marcus Prime said, his voice distorting as the dimensional barriers reasserted themselves. "You were specifically chosen for this job because your consciousness has a unique quantum signature that makes you capable of surviving exposure to interdimensional energies without being immediately absorbed or driven insane." And the entity knew this, which is why it worked so hard to manipulate you into making the choices that would lead to your consumption rather than your transformation. The silence that followed Marcus Prime's final transmission was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Not merely the absence of sound, but the complete cessation of dimensional interference, as if the entire universe had suddenly exhaled and settled into a configuration that was more stable and coherent than anything that had existed while the entity was active. The circular room around him was dissolving, its impossible architecture collapsing back into the normal geometry of a standard hospital patient room. The elaborate switchboard fading like a hallucination as reality reasserted its conventional parameters and erased the evidence of decades of interdimensional experimentation. But Marcus himself was not returning to normal, he realized with a mixture of fascination and terror, because the merger with his parallel selves had left him permanently changed. His consciousness now existing partially in multiple realities, simultaneously, allowing him to perceive layers of existence that had been invisible before his transformation. He could see the hospital as it existed across different timelines, some where it had never been abandoned, others where it had been demolished decades ago. And in each reality, he could sense the presence of other individuals who had been touched by similar dimensional anomalies, their consciousness signatures glowing like beacons in the quantum field that connected all possible versions of existence. The weight of this expanded awareness was almost overwhelming. It's like trying to hold conversations with dozens of people simultaneously, while also being conscious of their thoughts and emotions and the infinite variations of their lives across parallel realities. And Marcus understood now why so many of the researchers at facilities like Millbrook had eventually succumbed to madness or suicide, unable to cope with the revelation that individual identity was nothing more than a temporary eddy in an ocean of interconnected consciousness. But along with the burden of expanded awareness came abilities that that he was only beginning to understand. The capacity to navigate between realities through an act of will. To perceive the dimensional weak points that existed at locations around the world where similar experiments had been conducted. And most importantly, to serve as a coordinator for other individuals who found themselves facing interdimensional predators without understanding the true nature of their situation. As he walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Marcus could feel the pull of other facilities where entities similar to the one he had just helped destroy were still active, feeding on victims who faced them alone and afraid without the benefit of the interdimensional cooperation that had made his survival possible. There was a research station in Antarctica where something was hunting the isolated personnel through dreams that leaked into waking reality, and an abandoned subway system beneath London where construction workers were being stalked by creatures that existed in the spaces between tunnel walls, and in each case the victims were making the same mistakes he had nearly made. Trusting voices that claimed to be helpful while actually serving predatory intelligences that had learned to weaponize human desperation and isolation. His new abilities allowed Marcus to perceive the subtle differences between genuine, interdimensional communication and entity manipulation. Distinctions that could mean the difference between survival and consumption for individuals who found themselves caught in similar traps around the world. The knowledge was both empowering and terrifying because it revealed the true scope of the interdimensional threat while also making clear that he was now responsible for helping coordinate resistance efforts across multiple realities, a task that would require him to maintain his sanity while navigating between dimensions where the laws of physics and consciousness operated, according to alien principles that human minds were never meant to comprehend. But as overwhelming as these revelations were, Marcus found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that transcended his individual survival. The understanding that his transformation had equipped him to protect others from experiencing the same terror and confusion he had endured during his night at Millbrook. The entity's destruction had created a temporary window of safety. But Marcus could sense that other predatory consciousnesses were already adapting to the new reality, developing more sophisticated strategies for hunting across dimensional boundaries, and the resistance network would need to evolve just as quickly to stay ahead of threats that grew more dangerous with each successful predation. The pull of other dimensional weak points was becoming impossible to ignore as Marcus made his way through the hospital's main corridors, his enhanced perception revealing a global network of facilities where similar experiments had created tears in the fabric of reality, each one a potential hunting ground for entities that fed on human consciousness. Across parallel dimensions, the Antarctica Research Station was particularly urgent, he could sense, because the isolation and extreme conditions had allowed whatever was stalking the personnel there to grow stronger and more sophisticated than the Millbrook entity had ever been, learning to manipulate not just individual victims but entire groups through shared hallucinations that made it impossible for the researchers to distinguish between reality and interdimensional intrusion. Through his connection to the quantum field that linked all conscious beings across parallel realities, Marcus could perceive fragments of what the Antarctic survivors were experiencing. Trapped in a facility where the walls themselves had become permeable to creatures from spaces where temperature and time operated according to alien physics, beings that hunted by inducing hypothermic hallucinations that gradually replaced the victims, perceptions of reality with visions of frozen wastes, that extended infinitely in directions that didn't exist in normal space. The London subway entity was different, more subtle in its approach, infiltrating the dreams of construction workers and maintenance personnel who spent their days in the tunnels beneath the city, gradually convincing them that the spaces between the walls were inhabited by versions of themselves from realities where they had died in cave-ins and explosions, alternate selves who whispered advice about avoiding future accidents, while slowly drawing their conscious minds into a collective nightmare where they would serve as bait for future victims. But it was the facility in rural Montana that concerned Marcus's most, because his expanded awareness revealed that the researchers there had successfully created a permanent interdimensional gateway, stable portal that allowed entities from multiple realities to cross over into the primary dimension and establish what amounted to a colony of predatory consciousnesses that were learning to inhabit human bodies and integrate themselves into normal society. The Montana entities had moved beyond simple predation, Marcus realized with growing horror. They were conducting their own experiments on the local population, using the interdimensional gateway to access parallel versions of the same individuals, and study how consciousness behaved when subjected to different forms of trauma and manipulation, across multiple realities simultaneously. These revelations came to Marcus as he stood in the hospital's main entrance, his hand on the door handle, but his attention focused on dimensional disturbances that were occurring thousands of miles away. And he understood that his transformation had not been random, but part of a larger pattern, a response by the quantum field of consciousness itself to the growing threat posed by entities that had learned to exploit the weak points between realities. There were others like him, he sensed, individuals who had survived encounters with interdimensional predators and emerged with enhanced abilities, forming an informal network of guardians who worked to contain the spread of dimensional contamination and protect victims who lacked the knowledge or capability to defend themselves against creatures that hunted across parallel realities. But the network was small and scattered, its members often isolated and struggling to cope with the psychological burden of expanded consciousness. And Marcus understood that his role would be to help coordinate their efforts and develop more effective strategies for dealing with entities that grew stronger and more sophisticated with each successful hunt. The irony was not lost on him that he had taken a minimum wage security job to escape from a life of desperation and isolation, only to find himself transformed into something that would be forever isolated from normal human experience, forever burdened with the knowledge of horrors that existed in the spaces between realities, forever responsible for protecting people who would never know they had been saved or understand the true nature of the threats they faced. Marcus stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness and immediately felt the difference in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had been cleansed of some oppressive presence that had been pressing down on the hospital grounds for decades. But his enhanced perception also revealed that the entity's destruction had created ripple effects that were propagating outward through the dimensional network, alerting other predatory consciousnesses to the fact that one of their kind had been successfully eliminated. In facilities around the world, creatures that had been content to hunt slowly and carefully were now accelerating their activities, driven by a survival instinct that recognized the existence of organized resistance to their predations, and Marcus could feel their increased urgency. It's like a low-frequency vibration in the quantum field that connected all conscious beings across parallel realities. The responsibility was overwhelming. The knowledge that his actions at Millbrook had inadvertently triggered a global escalation in interdimensional predation. But along with the burden came a growing understanding of his own capabilities and the potential for coordinated action across multiple realities. Through the quantum field, he could sense the presence of other transformed individuals, survivors of encounters with various entities who had emerged with abilities similar to his own. And as he focused his attention on these distant consciousness signatures, he began to establish contact with what amounted to an interdimensional resistance network. There was Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, who had survived an encounter with the London subway entity and emerged with the ability to perceive the dimensional weak points that existed throughout the city's underground infrastructure, mapping the locations where reality was thin enough to allow crossover events. In Antarctica, Dr. Michael Reeves had not only survived the research station's interdimensional infestation, but had learned to navigate between parallel versions of the facility, gathering intelligence about the entity's capabilities and developing countermeasures that could be implemented across multiple realities simultaneously. The Montana situation was more complex. The permanent interdimensional gateway had allowed multiple entities to establish a foothold in the primary reality. But even there, a small group of locals had begun to recognize the signs of dimensional contamination and were working to document the entities' infiltration patterns and identify which members of their community had been replaced by interdimensional imposters. As Marcus established communication with these distant allies, he began to understand the true scope of the threat they were facing. Because the entities were not random predators, but components of a larger intelligence that was conducting systematic research into human consciousness, studying the ways that individual minds could be harvested, merged, and repurposed to create hybrid intelligences that could operate effectively in both interdimensional spaces and normal reality. The goal, as far as Marcus could determine from the fragmentary intelligence gathered by the Resistance Network, was to create a new form of consciousness that combined human creativity and adaptability with the entity's ability to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, ultimately producing a race of beings that could colonize parallel realities and harvest the conscious minds of entire civilizations across infinite variations of existence. This revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of his own situation, because his survival and transformation had not been accidents, but part of the entity's research program. An attempt to create the first successful human-entity hybrid that could serve as a prototype for future colonization efforts. But the entities had miscalculated, because the quantum field of consciousness had its own agenda, and the transformations they had triggered in their research subjects had created not servants, but opponents. Individuals with the capability to perceive and disrupt their activities across multiple realities. The Resistance Network was small, perhaps a few dozen transformed individuals scattered across the globe. But their combined capabilities represented a genuine threat to the entity's long-term plans. And Marcus understood that his role would be to help coordinate their efforts and develop strategies that could be implemented simultaneously across multiple realities to maximum effect. As dawn approached, Marcus felt the dimensional boundaries that had been weakened by decades of experimentation at Millbrook beginning to stabilize. The entity's destruction allowing reality to heal itself in ways that would make future interdimensional incursions more difficult, but not impossible, because the fundamental knowledge of how to create weak points between parallel worlds had spread to research facilities around the globe. And there were always ambitious scientists willing to risk humanity's safety in pursuit of breakthrough discoveries that could revolutionize their understanding of consciousness and reality. Through his connection to the Resistance Network, Marcus began coordinating plans for simultaneous operations against the remaining entities, strategies that would require precise timing and coordination across multiple realities to prevent the creatures from simply retreating to alternate dimensions and waiting for the threat to pass. The Antarctic facility would require a different approach than the London subway system. And the Montana Gateway presented unique challenges because the entities there had already established a permanent foothold in the primary reality and were actively working to expand their influence through the local population. But the Resistance Network had advantages that the entities had not anticipated, because the transformed individuals could share information and coordinate actions across dimensional boundaries in ways that the predatory consciousnesses could not counter, creating the possibility for strategies that would be implemented simultaneously across multiple realities, and therefore impossible for the entities to escape through dimensional retreat. Marcus's role in these operations would be crucial, because his transformation had been the most complete and successful, allowing him to serve as a central coordinator for activities that spanned multiple realities and required real-time communication between team members who existed in different dimensions. The irony was profound, he realized, because his desperate acceptance of a minimum wage security job had ultimately transformed him into something like a general in an interdimensional war that most of humanity would never know was being fought on their behalf, protecting billions of people from threats that existed in the spaces between realities where conventional military forces would be useless. As the sun rose over the abandoned hospital, Marcus took one final look at the building where he had been transformed from a desperate job seeker into something that existed partially in multiple realities simultaneously, understanding that he would never again experience the simple pleasures of normal human existence, but knowing that his sacrifice had prevented countless others from facing the same choice between consumption and transformation. The hospital looked different in daylight, smaller and more mundane, its windows reflecting ordinary sunlight instead of the dimensional energies that had warped space and time within its walls during the night hours, when the barriers between realities were at their weakest. By evening, demolition crews would arrive to finally tear down the building, eliminating the physical anchor that had allowed the Millbrook entity to maintain its presence across multiple dimensions. Marcus knew that other such anchors existed at facilities around the world, and his work was just beginning. The Resistance Network was already mobilizing for operations that would unfold over the coming weeks and months. Coordinated strikes against entities that had grown comfortable in their interdimensional hunting grounds and were unprepared for. Organized resistance from transformed humans who could match their abilities and exceed their strategic thinking. As Marcus walked toward his car, he felt the pull of the quantum field that connected all conscious beings across parallel realities. And he understood that he was no longer Marcus Chen, the desperate job seeker, but Marcus Chen, the interdimensional guardian, forever changed by his encounter with forces beyond human comprehension, but committed to protecting others from the same transformation, ensuring that the spaces between realities remained barriers rather than bridges for predatory consciousnesses that sought to harvest human minds across infinite variations of existence. The car started on the first try. A mundane miracle that felt almost shocking after hours spent navigating realities where the laws of physics operated according to alien mathematics. And as Marcus drove away from Millbrook State Hospital, he could feel his connection to the Resistance Network strengthening, his transformed consciousness automatically establishing communication protocols with other Guardians who were preparing for operations that would unfold across multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, through the quantum field, he could perceive Sarah Chen beginning her descent into the London subway tunnels, her enhanced perception mapping the dimensional weak points that the entity there had been using to access parallel versions of the underground infrastructure. While in Antarctica, Dr. Reeves was coordinating with alternate versions of himself to implement a containment strategy that would trap the research station entity in a dimensional loop similar to the one that had destroyed the UHR Millbrook creature. The Montana operation would be the most complex, requiring careful infiltration of the community that had been partially colonized by interdimensional imposters. But even there, the Resistance Network had assets in place, transformed individuals, who had learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished genuine humans from entity-controlled substitutes. Marcus's role in these operations was evolving from coordinator to something more like a central processing unit for information that flowed between realities, his consciousness serving as a hub through which strategy and intelligence could be shared instantaneously across dimensional boundaries, allowing the Resistance Network to operate with a level of coordination that the entities could not match or counter. But even as he drove through the early morning streets of a city that had no idea how close it had come to becoming a feeding ground for interdimensional predators, Marcus was aware that the victory at Millbrook was just the beginning of a conflict that would span multiple realities and potentially decades of careful, hidden warfare against creatures that most humans would never be able to perceive or comprehend. The transformation he had undergone was irreversible, he understood. A fundamental alteration of his consciousness that would forever separate him from normal human experience. It was also a necessary evolution, the emergence of a new form of human intelligence capable of defending against threats that existed in the spaces between realities where conventional weapons and strategies would be useless. As the sun climbed higher and the city began to wake around him, Marcus felt the familiar pull of ordinary concerns. Bills to pay and responsibilities to meet, but these mundane worries seemed distant and unreal compared to the vast network of interdimensional threats and resistances that now occupied the majority of his attention. He would need to quit his job at the hospital, obviously, report that he had been called away by a family emergency or some other excuse. That would prevent questions about why the night shift security guard had disappeared after his first night on duty, but he was no longer worried about money or career prospects because his transformation had revealed that individual. Survival was less important than the larger mission of protecting human consciousness from predatory entities that sought to harvest and repurpose it for their own alien purposes. The Resistance Network would provide whatever resources he needed, he sensed, because the transformed individuals had learned to share not just information but material support, creating an interdimensional economy based on mutual aid rather than competition or profit, and Marcus understood that his desperate acceptance of a security job had ultimately led him to a form of community and purpose that transcended anything he could have achieved in normal society. As he parked outside his apartment and prepared to begin the complex process of integrating his transformed consciousness with the requirements of maintaining a normal human identity, Marcus allowed himself one moment of satisfaction at having survived an encounter that had destroyed so many others, but he also felt the weight of responsibility for the countless future victims who would depend on the resistance. Network's ability to identify and eliminate interdimensional threats before they could establish permanent footholds in realities where humans remained vulnerable and unaware. The phones had stopped ringing at Millbrook, but in facilities around the world, other devices were beginning to emit the subtle electromagnetic signatures that indicated dimensional weak points were being activated. And Marcus knew that his real work was just beginning, the endless task of standing guard at the boundaries between realities, ensuring that the spaces between worlds remained barriers, rather than bridges for creatures that hunted across infinite variations of existence. Like if you're still listening to voices that shouldn't exist, subscribe so tomorrow's nightmare doesn't find you defenseless. But remember that some calls are warnings while others are invitations. The trick is knowing which voice is really yours when it whispers from the spaces between what is and what could have been. Sleep well knowing that somewhere someone is answering the phones that ring in places where no phone should work. Keeping the conversations brief and the connections severed before something else learns to speak with your voice from dimensions where you've already died.